Hi, I'm Karen von Oppen. I'm one of the workshop teachers here at the Gaylord Gallery. I'm going to be showing you paper making today. We're going to do some fun stuff. First, I want to thank the people who've made this possible. This is A Twist on Papermaking with Karen von Oppen. It's hosted by the Gaylord Area Council for the Arts, funding from Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs, and the National Endowment for the Arts. So thank you so much to them for making this possible. Okay, paper making is really fun, really cool, really inspiring, but you do need a few things to do this. It's a little involved when it comes to supplies. I bought a paper making kit years ago, which is the kit that I used to do the different papers that I'm going to show you, and the kit I'm going to use today when I do the demonstration. It's a little bit smaller. This is excuse me. This is a mold and decal. Technically, in real paper making, the mold and the decal are two different pieces, but this makes it a lot easier. They've put the screen right onto a frame. It's just stapled in the back. It's nice and taut, and you don't really need to have to separate the two. So this is an old kit that is no longer available. These are your couching sheets. I always thought it was couching, but apparently it's couching. And they do give you a little, or they did give you a little packet of things that you can include in your paper, and I will show you some examples. Now, the kit that I want to show you is something that you can actually purchase online. This kit is no longer available. This is something from Arnold Grummer's, and it's a little bit bigger. You can get smaller ones, but since I already had a small one, I decided, well, let's go with a bigger one. And this one actually is separate. So this is your decal. It comes with a screen, which they have made separate. And what you do when you make the paper is you put your paper pulp on the screen on top of this support, and then you put the decal on, you put your pulp in there, and then it's easier just to remove the paper off the screen by taking off the decal. And it also comes with something that helps you press the paper flat. I haven't used it, so I believe in the instructions, it looks like the water will go through this. So when you go to take your water, get your water out of the paper pulp, it'll come up through the screen and into your sponge. I know this sounds confusing. I'll explain it all. And these are the couching sheets that came with this particular kit. And these are actually paper. The ones that came with this are like felt, a dense felt. This kit also came with some really beautiful pastel inclusions through flowers and seed pods, and they've been dyed, so they're very colorful and beautiful. And it also came with some cotton linter shred pulp. So you can just throw this in your blender and with some additional paper, and grind it all up, pulp it all up, blend it all up, and this will give you a good start to getting your first piece of paper going. So I'm going to put this away because we're not going to use this. But this kit, I think, was about $29, $30, and it is the larger size. You can get smaller ones for less money. You can also find videos online how to make your own mold and decal. But you know, it's easier to buy it. And I did forget to say, these are linting sheets that came with this original kit. And again, it's just pressed cotton that you can rip up and throw in your blender and make your pulp with these, plus some additional paper. So, I like to use, rather than buying expensive felting and couching sheets, I really love blue shop towels. They work great. You can reuse them. I have ironed them. I have thrown them in the dryer and reused them several times. There will come a time where I have to throw them out, but they work great in helping soak up the excess paper, excess water out of the paper, excuse me, and they're cheap. So I'm going to get set up here and we'll be back in a minute. In addition to the kits, there are a few things you're going to need. Obviously you need a blender. And it's a good idea to have a pretty good one. You can probably find one at, the thrift store. This is an old one, but it's pretty powerful. This happens to be an Osterizer, and it works really good in making the mold. I have, in my desperation to find the right equipment, I did use one of those Nutribullet things, and it did a really good job, but they're small. And I think as long as you have a good blender, you don't need all that much power. So I also have a wooden spoon for stirring, a chopstick for stirring little things. I do have a rubber spatula to scrape some of the paper that doesn't want to go down into the blades. So you also need a sponge, at least one. I have two in two different sizes. These are the cellulose sponges, sort of the old-fashioned sponges, the ones that that they sell now for kitchen and dishes and stuff. Not so great. These are really much better. And I got these at Ace Hardware, but you can get them probably pretty much anywhere. Okay, I have water. I have actually filtered water because you don't want anything weird in your water. You don't want it to get into your paper. A bin, a plastic bin. I have a strainer in case I need to strain the water out of the paper for any reason, the pulp. Towels. Lots and lots of towels. These are just sort of rag towels, clean rag towels. And you need these so that when you have your pulp in your mold and decal, it's going to be very, very wet. So you're going to want to put it down on a paper towel so the paper towel soaks up the water, and then you're going to press it from the top with the sponge, and you're going to get the water out from underneath and the water out from on top. And that is how you're going to get it to the point where you can separate it out of the mold and take it over to someplace where you can dry it. So I have an iron handy because that works really great in drying up your paper some more. I've got layers down here because I need to protect the table. I mean, you can work on an ironing board, obviously, but you are going to want not a mushy surface because you want to keep your paper flat. You don't want anything with a pattern because you don't want the pattern on your paper. Well, maybe you do, but that's a whole different thing. This is the stuff that they cover ironing boards with. It's supposed to keep the heat away from anything underneath. And then I have a pressing cloth, and that's just to try and keep everything clean. Your paper, everything underneath, everything needs to remain clean, or you're going to get weird things in your paper. So this is our drying station over here. I have a rolling pin, and I like to use this to flatten out any irregularities in the paper. And what else? That is a good beginning. I have done some experimenting, and I'm actually going to, I was saving one experiment to show you guys. I have paper pulp already made to save time. You can add color into your pulp. This one is, I like to use acid-free paper, first of all. I shred it up. I use a shredder because doing it with my hands is just really long and tedious. So this is already pre-made. I made this a couple days ago. It'll keep for a couple of days, but you don't want to keep it in a container for too long because it actually will start to smell bad and get moldy. This has acrylic paint to give it some color. For this I used Hooker's green and white acrylic paint, and it was added to acid-free paper pulp. This one, more acid-free. I used Payne's Gray and Cobalt Blue acrylic paint to give this some color. And this was mostly construction paper. It was mostly gray construction paper with some other bits of white, I think, other acid-free scrap paper. This one is, I kept this one white, and again, this is just more various acid-free papers that I shredded up in a shredder and then put in here and pulped it up. Okay, so here's some watercolor paper. I want to know if we can make watercolor paper. Now, when I have made other papers, they don't really take watercolor well. They just kind of soak it all up too much. And the great thing about watercolor paper is that it doesn't soak it up quite as much as like this raw paper does. And you have time to actually paint and play with your technique, your watercolor technique. So we're going to find out, and you're going to find out with me, if you can make watercolor paper out of watercolor paper, and if it will have the same sort of paper properties that you can actually watercolor on. So, before we do that, I'm going to show you some examples of some really beautiful things you can do with paper. Okay, here is just a piece of white paper. It's got a really beautiful edge. It's a little thinner. It's basic. It's got a beautiful texture to it. Kept that one white. This was made from just brown craft paper. Not real exciting. This was also some construction paper. I laid this on a little heavy, so it's kind of got the consistency of cardstock, but it's got a really nice texture to it. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see it? Okay. So there's some colored paper. This is a pink paper that was actually made from recycled handmade tissue type paper. And if you get a hold of some of this and you put it through your shredder, be very careful. Shredders don't like tissue paper, and I actually destroyed my father's shredder and had to buy a new one. So that's a do not do. But it does make nice paper if you can get it to work. This is paper that has leaves put into the pulp and all shredded up along with the paper pulp. It's kind of a neat texture and look to it. And this was, I started adding things into it. And these are just leaves, sort of leaf skeletons that I placed on the paper pulp when it was in the mold and decal. And then I carefully put a little paper bits on there in order to keep them down onto the paper. This is actually pulped with spices. This one might be cinnamon. If you put clove or cinnamon or anything with a nice aroma to it, your paper comes out smelling really neat, really nice. Makes great cards. This is actually a really old piece of paper from something I did years ago, which is significant in that these little flowers, these are hydrangea flowers, they've actually held up. I mean, this piece of paper is probably 10 or 15 years old, and they have actually still held up in there. So they last. This was made with these inclusions. These are sunflower petals, and this is what came with that original kit. And again, I did the same thing here. I laid the pulp, I filled it, what am I trying to say? When I had the pulp on the screen, I laid these down and then I pressed more pulp on top, and it kind of gave it a thick, rough, sort of bumpy texture that's actually kind of nice. This, I do leather work, and these are actually little holes from punching out holes for lacing in my, I think this was probably from a melt. And I just threw them in there on top of the pulp, and it's kind of fun party paper. This one I made with the embellishments that came with the Arnold Grubbers paper. Very pretty, kind of festive. And you can get really fun and creative with this stuff too. Okay, this, I went into the garden and I picked a couple of flowers off the only plant that was flowering, because this is Gaylord. I put cinnamon around the edges, and then I painted blue around the edges while it was still wet, so it really spread in, and it really turned out kind of nice. It's even pretty on the back. So that is something you can start doing too, is adding things, adding color, adding watercolor. And these are a couple of paint chips. I was just testing color. This one I think this started out pink and I wasn't happy with it, so I started watercoloring around the edges and inside. And what's really neat with these handmade papers is you can start layering them. I mean, you can make really beautiful shapes and color combinations and textures, and I love the edges and the holes in this, and it's just really beautiful, you know, against the background. And you know, they do make beautiful cards if you're into doing that. You can stamp on them. You can paint your embellishments. I put some gold paint on this. Now, I started experimenting when it came to this piece. I decided that it might be easier to separate the paper off the molded decal if maybe I added a little bit of glue to it. And so what I did was I have some Craft Bond, the Elmer's Craft Bond paper, fabric and paper glue. It's acid-free. I like to keep everything acid-free, that way it's archival. And I mixed up about a teaspoon with a little bit of water, mixed it up real good, and I put it into the pulp towards the end and mixed it up in there real good. And then that's when after that I laid it on the paper, on the molded decal. And that really did help keep it together. It's a nice, firm, sturdy piece. So I haven't seen anything online about doing that, so I don't know if there are any long-term consequences to doing that, but it sure did work great for that. Okay, and this was a little piece that I decided to emboss. And I did it with this rubber stamp. And I like this because it's got a square, the whole thing is square rather than having the outline of the shape itself. Those I didn't try it, but it didn't appeal to me. So I like that it's got the outline and the shape inside. Can you see that in there? And you can go in and you can paint this. You can cut it out, you can layer it on something else. It'd be pretty, you know, if you cut it against a blue background or any background. So there's a lot you can do with these papers. And one thing I got really excited about was embossing. and this is a piece of a lino cut plate that I did that I pressed into the cut plate, and I will explain how I did this towards the end. It's probably hard to see because it's paper casting actually is what it's called. I keep calling it embossing, but it's all about the light. Is that seeable in there? Yeah. Okay, so we'll talk about that one towards the end. So I will clean all this up and we will make some paper. Okay, this is our acid-free white pulp that I made from various scraps of acid-free paper. Probably a lot of it was just sketchbook paper. And I'm gonna pour, let's see, can't read this, a cup? I guess it's about 2 cups, I think. We just want to get a nice sturdy, thick enough piece of paper that, you know, it's substantial enough to do something with. Okay, so one of the things that you don't want to do is start at the highest setting, because that can end in disaster. I've done that. Start slow, start on stir. Okay, and since that was already pre-pulped, then we didn't have to really do that for too long. It does probably take about 3 minutes to get it to pulp up. And I like to use warm or hot water. It kind of helps break down the paper fibers. This one I have actually had soaking in here for, I think I did this yesterday, so about a day. If you soak it in hot water before you try to put it in the blender, an hour, 2 hours is better than, the longer the better, is better than half an hour, which I think is which one of the instructions says. But longer is much better, it gives you a smoother pulp. So, got a little water in here. I have, I don't know, half an inch, I guess, in there. And I'm gonna take my screen. I'm going to set it in there. Now there are a couple ways to do this, and I'll explain the other way, but I'm doing it this way to save time, and it's a little bit less messy this way too. So I am literally just going to pour it right into the screen. Jiggle it around a little bit to settle it. Smooth it out, even it out. And then bring it up slowly. I'm just going to press this into the corners a little bit. And give it a few seconds to drain. The more water you can get out of it at this stage, the less wet your towels will be. And usually when I make paper, I do a whole bunch of pulp at a time. I do a whole bunch of pieces at a time. And at some point, I'm going to have to take my towels and throw them all in the dryer, because they do get pretty wet. This is a towel that's folded several times. I've probably got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got 8 layers here. So I can get a lot of water into this towel. sponge. Press down evenly. Try to soak up some of that water. The water is going to go into the sponge and into the towels through the screen. Lift up carefully. Do the same thing all the way up and down. You'll have to wring out your sponge. Okay, when you think you've got about as much out of there as you can into the sponge, that's when I switch over to the shop towels, because they will soak up a lot of water. Now, what I like to do with the shop towels is use a fresh one because it'll be smooth. Some of the old ones might have wrinkles in them from putting them in the dryer and then literally ironing them, but you don't want those wrinkles in your paper. Or maybe you do. Could be a really cool effect. The wrinkled one you can put on top. Give it a few good presses. Feel like you've got as much water out as you can. Carefully peel it off. Wet shop towel. Now you can try to peel it off from inside, starting with the corner, or you can try to turn this upside down and pat it so that it falls out on its own. And I've done it both ways. You have to be careful. It doesn't always come out perfect. So I try to loosen it up a little bit on the underside. Okay, let's try flipping it. Falling away from the screen. And that worked. Now what you have is a soggy piece of paper. It's going to have the impression of the screen on the back, which I've never really liked very much. So what I like to do at this point is get another couple of fresh towels. Flat, fresh towels. Carefully lay it down. And then grab your rolling pin. And carefully press some of that screen print impression You have to be careful that it doesn't stick to your rolling pin. Sometimes put another piece of paper, shop towel on top. And that also helps get some of the water out. Working with limited space here. Stay. Keep trying to press as much water out of that paper as you can before you go over to the iron, which I'm going to turn on now. Get that warmed up. Pretty hard to get all the impression out. But you can do a pretty good job of getting most of it out. Okay, so now we have a really beautiful piece of paper. I like the texture on the top. Sometimes I press it out, sometimes I leave it. Actually, the iron will do a good job of smoothing that out as well. So let's move over to our ironing section here. Now you have to keep your iron very clean if you intend on putting it directly on the paper. And that is why I like to use a clean pressing cloth. This is just an old, sort of a threadbare sheet, so I can still see through it a little bit so I know where my paper is. Okay, just go light at first. I have this set at sort of a medium-high setting. Apparently I had this too close to my shop towels. Just go over it easy. It's going to take a while to dry it. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this and then we'll move on to the next piece. And then let it dry on its own. And then maybe hit it again with the iron later. But just to give you an idea, it's still wet, but it's pretty cool. And it's acid free, so it's archival. You can draw on it. You can make cards out of it. You can layer it. We can leave that there for now. And let's move on to our watercolor paper. Okay, so this is the one I'm interested in experimenting with. Okay, I've got the leftover white paper in here. I'm sure this little bit of pulp left over in here is not going to contaminate it too much, but I'm just going to get some of it out just in case. This is a soggy, soggy towel, so we'll set this aside and bring our next towel over. Okay. A couple of handfuls. Oh, that's right. I shredded up a drawing I did on this watercolor paper, so some of this has pencil marks on it, so we'll see how that works. Okay, you are going to want a good bit of water in there when you're going to blend this up. This is not warm water. Normally I would use warm or hot water. It's not really feasible right now here, so this is just clean distilled water. Or not distilled, I guess it's filtered somehow. Okay, start slow. First you have to plug it in. Oh, we only have, I don't know, 2 plugs. Okay. Alrighty. If your blender seems like it's working a little too hard, add a little more water, which is what we're going to do. Okay, I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to let this go for a couple of minutes, and we'll be back when it's done. Okay, so we've given this a couple minutes of blending, and I'll give it one more quick mix. And then we'll pour it into our mold. Okay, now this is the watercolor paper. And I have a feeling it's got something in it, sizing maybe, to keep it together and to help it, take the watercolor paint. It did not, it didn't seem to shred quite as smoothly as the other papers, and so that could be why. Drain. Okay, I'm going to let this sit for a second and drain. And I'm going to check our other piece of paper, which is still pretty damp. Turn our iron back on. Okay, so that's what it's looking like. Definitely very oatmeal-y looking. right now. This happens to have been Strathmore cold press watercolor paper that I put through the shredder and pulped up. I think it's from an old sketchbook, so that may be why it's looking a little beigey. Let some of the water out. You want to be careful of the edges of your sponge when you're pressing the water out, because you don't want those edges to make indentations into your paper, because sometimes they're kind of hard to get back out again. It's sort of a learning process as you go along. Now, cold press paper is rougher than hot press. Hot press watercolor paper has a much smoother surface. And I guess we have a choice. We can either make this really smooth or we can keep it a little rougher. It just depends on how much we press it, roll, and iron. Okay, that's pretty wet. Turn it over. The other side is a little drier. Let's give it one more go with a sponge, and then we'll use some of the shop towels. Okay, nice fresh towel, nice and flat. Okay, I'm going to press this as dry as I can before we get it onto the iron, so we'll come back after I've gotten some of this water out of here. Okay, I think I've gotten about as much water out of here as I can, so let's get this out of the mold. Okay, it came out nicely. And once again, we've got our indentations from the screen. So let's try to get rid of that. Alright, I'm going to take a pile of towels here with a smooth one on top. Try and get the wrinkles out of these things. And again. Press with a rolling pin. Get more water out. Only press as hard as you're comfortable with. You have to make sure that it doesn't stick to the rolling pin. To make this a little smoother, so I am going to roll the top as well. Start off gentle. And then use a little more pressure as you go along. And it's definitely smoothing out. And like rolling dough, it's probably getting a little bigger too. Added bonus. Okay. Red slab of paper. Bring it over to the ironing station. Okay, this is going to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to see if I can actually get this to dry. So we'll be back when I've had a little success drying this puppy out. Okay, so we have dried our watercolor paper, our so-called watercolor paper. We still don't know if it's actually watercolor paper. We're going to set this aside right now first, though. And, excuse me, I'm going to show you, before we do that, I did go ahead and do the blue piece, and that is drying right now, and that is actually a really beautiful blue-gray color. And if you compare it to what the pulp looked like when it was pulp, it's quite a difference. It lightened up a lot. So that's almost dry. We'll dry that up with the iron a bit later. And I also went ahead and threw my green pulp in the blender, and I added some glue to it. So we'll see how that turns out. This is, like I said before, this is the Craft Bond Elmer's fabric and paper glue. And I just put like a teaspoon in here with some water, shook it up, threw it in the blender, blended it up, and then I poured it into the mold. And it's quite frothy, and that's from the glue, I'm sure. So if you can see how that looks a little bit different, but that will all pat down. And I really do believe that it helps hold the whole paper together. So that is going to be something that we will dry. And we'll come back when I get this patted down and ready to put under the iron. And one thing I do want to do when I do colors is I don't want to get any of the paint or the color into my sponges because we have to keep those clean. So I do use my shop towels for that. And what I usually do is I start with some of the older ones just to soak up the water. Because remember, these are reusable a few times anyway. And I can feel the bubbles popping underneath. It's a kind of a cool feeling. So it's starting to flatten down. And it is sticking a little bit to the paper, to the shop towels, because it's got that glue in there. So that will not be used again. So I will finish patting this out, and then we'll be back and I'll show you some more things. So I have brought this out of the water. I have dried it and I'm rolling it. And I'm going to show it to you. It's really kind of beautiful. I think the glue, because this happened with one of my other papers, it kind of creates this marbling or modeling or I don't know what you would call it, but the variation in tones. Now, there is white paint in with this green. So I don't know if it's the white paint or if it's the glue doing it, but you know, that's the fun of experimenting. So you're doing this with me. So it's a really beautiful sheet. And that's the back that I rolled out. But I didn't want to affect that beautiful texture and visual texture that's coming through on the front. So I will set this aside. We'll dry this in a bit. And we're going to see if our watercolor paper was a success. So I'm going to get some watercolors. And some water. So here's our paper. This is the back, this is the front. We're not going to do anything fancy. I'm just going to throw a little paint on there. We'll start with red. Nope, not really acting like watercolor paper. It's soaking in too much. If this was watercolor paper, it would sit more on the surface and you would have more of an opportunity to move your paint around. They must be coated somehow. So we have our answer. I mean, you can certainly paint on it. It's just not going to have the same properties. And it really does soak it up, and you really need a lot of water and paint. Okay, so there's our answer. All right, so we'll move on to the next thing. Okay, so this is the white paper that we did first. This was the first one that we made. And I wanted to show you that it really has a very nice tooth to take pastel, soft pastel. Probably oil as well, but I don't have any of those here. So while you can't really do a regular watercolor painting on these, you can pastel beautifully on them. So I'm just going to take a few and show you. Now this is very textured. You can smooth it out. When you make the paper, you can make it smoother. Let's see, I've got some pastel pencils here. And the lines are very clean. Let's okay, the color definitely rides on top of the paper. But if you get in there with a blender or even your finger, you can blend it into the crevices. So it will take pastel quite nicely. Will be totally different from the sanded paper that you might buy in the store. But you know, it's all these different papers have different applications, and you can really do a lot with them using your imagination. So there's one last thing I want to show you, and we'll be right back with that. Okay, so in the beginning I showed you this piece, and I'm going to show you how I did this. All right. This is the entire image. This is just a piece of it that I did as an experiment to see if I could make it work. And I was actually able to make it work. So hopefully you can see this, because it's totally dependent on the light and the shadows. But it's a dragon with wings and a tail comes swirling down. This is the plate that I carved out of linoleum. It's a lino plate. And some of the areas are pretty deep, and they take paper really nicely. So all I did to get that was take some paper pulp. I'm going to shake this up. And it's a good idea to do this on a towel. And I'll just pick a spot. This is kind of interesting right up here, and it's got some nice definition. So I did this a little differently. I scooped out pulp, let it drain a little bit, and then I literally just plopped it on. And I covered the entire image, doing it this way. We're just going to do a small portion here. I made sure I patted it out evenly. See if I can get a little more pulp out of this. So if you're going to do anything like this with a lino cut, just make sure your cuts are deep enough to get the dramatic light effect. Okay. And you want to very carefully soak up some of that water. Start gentle, because you don't want to pick it up off the plate. Whoops, and I just did. Case in point. Now this does not have any of the glue in the pulp, but what I did do on the finished piece was brush some of the diluted glue across the back of it and then let it dry. I didn't want there to be glue in there that would make it stick to the plate. Okay, you can start pressing a little bit harder, and you can see that it's starting to press into those crevices. And the image starts to appear. Now this is pretty hard to get out of here while it's still wet. So what I did was I let it dry. Once I had the whole thing covered, I let it dry on its own. And it actually took a couple of days. And then I very, very carefully peeled it off. But you get the idea. You can see, you can feel the bumps. Now, this is a very thin piece. I think the piece I made is probably a lot thicker than that. But just to show you how I did it. And you can even, you know, you can do this on rubber stamps, anything that you might carve. So that's the idea. Okay, so I did decide that I'm going to try to peel this off of here while it's wet. And it's tricky, and you have to be really careful. Yeah, really careful. It's, like I said, it's a thin piece, so it's definitely tricky. Okay, we're losing some of our edges, but you can already see that the image is in there. But I definitely recommend either letting it dry completely or at least mostly before trying to get it out of there. Okay, you can't, it's not very recognizable as a dragon, but you can see the texture forming. That is one floppy dragon. So there's a lot you can do. Okay, so we're back over here at our drying station, and this is our green piece. And I'm going to dry it up, and it's going to lighten up when it dries. And I'm hoping that that, you know, these beautiful variations in hue will still be visible. So I go over it a little bit first with my pressing cloth. It helps to flatten it out as well. You can't be too impatient with this step because you want it to dry fairly evenly and flat and not too fast. This is a thin piece, so it's actually drying pretty fast, so that's good. Now I've made sure my iron is clean, so I can safely, as long as it's dry a little bit, you can't put the iron directly on it when it's too wet. But once it starts to dry, it'll glide over it much easier. And it's really lightening up, and we are losing some of that beautiful color. You just never know what you're going to get. Wow, what a big difference. It's still pretty cool though. No steam, turn your steam off. Okay, so all these cool different colorations going on in here are either from the glue or from the fact that I've got white paint going on in here as well as the green, or a combination of both. But I really like that. And our blue is just about dry. And the edges, I just love the edges, the decal edges on these papers. So this is what the pulp, actually it's not that much of a difference in color. It was pretty dark when it was wet, but it actually is almost the same color as the pulp. And we saw that the blue did lighten up quite a bit. So I hope I've inspired you. I hope you go off and do some really cool things with paper making. And thank you very much.